In the spring of 2022, a wildlife biologist reached down into a fyke net anchored in 4 feet of cold water on the Current River in the Missouri Ozarks and found something that required 2 people to lift onto the aluminum research boat. The animal was a male alligator snapping turtle. Its carapace, the arched, ridged shell that runs from the neck scute to the tail, measured 27 inches from front to back. Its head was the circumference of a large man's fist, and the hooked beak curving from the front of that head was stained the color of old iron, thick at the base and narrowing to a recurved tip. When the team placed the animal on a portable field scale in the bow of the boat, the reading came to 171 pounds. On any river in the American South, where alligator snapping turtles have been documented for centuries and the deep backwater sloughs of the Mississippi Delta hold the largest specimens, 171 pounds would register as exceptional, but not outside the expected range. Old males in the lower Mississippi River drainage have been reliably measured above 200 pounds. The record, a Kansas specimen taken in 1937, was documented at 249 pounds, a figure that wildlife biologists treat with some caution but cannot formally dismiss. But the Current River is not the lower Mississippi drainage. It is a cold upland river, fed by springs discharging from limestone aquifers in the Ozark Plateau, running clear over chert gravel in a country of oak ridges and cedar bluffs where alligator snapping turtles were commercially harvested through much of the 20th century and where legal protection has existed only since 1984 in Missouri. In a recovering population, on a cold upland river, in a corridor that decades of survey work suggest had been substantially depleted, a turtle of that size and weight should sit at the very edge of what the population could reasonably produce in this time frame. It was not the edge case. And it was not the only one. One large turtle is an old turtle. One old turtle found during a recovery survey is not a puzzle. It is biology. Straightforward and expected. Given enough time and enough food and enough protection from harvest, the animal grows. The largest wild specimens are simply the oldest ones. The species is capable of producing them. The records confirm it has done so. But what the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission and the Missouri Department of Conservation began documenting across multiple Ozark drainage systems after approximately 2015 changes the shape of that simple explanation. Survey teams using fyke nets set overnight in deep channel pools and slow river bends had been working these waterways systematically for more than a decade as part of long-term population recovery monitoring. The methodology was standardized and repeatable. Nets were deployed in established transects, checked on documented schedules, and the data went into state wildlife databases that tracked individual captures across years. What those databases began accumulating, particularly from 2017 onward, was a size distribution of adult males that exceeded what the recovery models had projected. The models were built on reasonable assumptions about harvest history and biological recovery rates. A population stripped of its oldest and heaviest individuals by decades of commercial turtle harvest would need multiple generations of protected recruitment before producing large males in meaningful numbers. A male alligator snapping turtle does not approach heavy adult mass until it has grown uninterrupted for 30 years or more. In populations where males above a useful commercial size had been systematically removed for decades, the expected weight distribution of adult males in early-stage recovery should skew toward younger, lighter animals. The surveys were not finding that distribution. A 110-pound male from the Spring River drainage in northeast Arkansas in 2018. A 137-pound animal from a White River tributary in 2020. 3 separate animals exceeding 120 pounds captured in the Current River corridor between 2020 and 2023, across different survey seasons and different river reaches. The numbers are not enormous. The sample sizes remain limited in the way that any ongoing field survey produces limited samples. But the pattern is accumulating, year by year, river reach by river reach, in a way that researchers closest to the data describe as inconsistent with the expected recovery curve. 1 report is an anecdote. 7 is a pattern. Macrocheles taminki, The alligator snapping turtle is the largest freshwater turtle in North America. That designation carries real weight, because North American freshwater turtle diversity includes some substantial animals. Common snapping turtles in certain northern lake systems reach 60 and 70 pounds. Softshell turtles in large river systems grow to comparable sizes. But the alligator snapper occupies a different scale and a different ecological register entirely. A mature male in a productive river reach is built less like what most people imagine when they picture a turtle, and more like a piece of eroded river geology that has developed the capacity for motion. The shell does not run smooth. 3 prominent keels cross the carapace from front to back, giving the shell a serrated, ridged profile that breaks up any familiar outline when the animal sits motionless against river substrate. The head is massive in proportion to the body, the neck thick and covered in fleshy projections called papillae that catch current and give the animal a coral-textured appearance in the water. The jaw terminates in a sharp, recurved hook at the tip, the feature that produced both the common name and a documented bite force measured in controlled conditions at forces exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch. The jaw is not used to chase prey. It is used to receive prey. Inside the mouth, on the tongue, sits the most unusual hunting adaptation in North American freshwater. A small, pink, worm-shaped appendage that the turtle wiggles while lying completely still on the bottom of a river pool, mouth open, waiting. Fish that investigate the movement are taken. The turtle does not pursue. It does not adjust its position. It holds its place on the substrate, often for hours without surfacing. And it lets the lure do the work. In cold water, where the metabolic cost of maintaining body temperature is reduced and the energetic efficiency of stillness over pursuit is maximized, this is an extraordinarily effective strategy. A large alligator snapping turtle in a deep Ozark Channel pool may occupy the same position for days, moving only to rise and breathe. The species was formally divided into 3 recognized species in a 2014 taxonomic revision. Macrochelys taminki retained the name for the Mississippi River drainage population, which includes the Ozark River systems of Missouri and Arkansas. Macrochelys suwanneensis was designated for the Suwannee River drainage in Florida and Georgia. Macrochelys apalachicola covers the Apalachicola River system in the Florida Panhandle. For the purposes of the Ozark surveys, the relevant animal is Macrochelys taminki as currently defined, with its historical range extending from East Texas north through the Mississippi corridor into Iowa and Kansas. The International Union for Conservation of Nature lists the species as vulnerable, a designation reflecting documented population declines across much of its historical range through the commercial harvest decades of the mid-20th century. The species is fully protected from commercial harvest in every state where it naturally occurs. What is less clear is how a population protected for 35 years in an isolated upland river corridor should be producing the size distribution the surveys are recording. The Ozark Plateau is geologically old and structurally unusual in ways that matter to this question. The plateau sits across the border of Missouri and Arkansas, underlain by heavily karstified limestone and dolomite that has been dissolving and riddling with voids for hundreds of millions of years, producing one of the most extensive cave and spring networks on the continent. The rivers draining the Ozarks do not run brown and warm like lowland agricultural rivers. They run clear and cold, fed by springs discharging from underground aquifers at temperatures that remain between 54 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, regardless of summer air temperatures on the surface. The current river in Shannon and Carter counties in Missouri is fed by 17 documented major springs. The Big Spring Complex near Van Buren, Missouri, discharges an average of 276 million gallons of water per day, making it one of the largest single opening springs in the country. The Spring River in Lawrence and Fulton counties in northeast Arkansas draws from comparable upland sources and moves fast enough over its gravel bars to oxygenate the water column far more thoroughly than most low-gradient southern river systems. These are not typical alligator snapping turtle habitat in the way the species is classically associated with slow, warm, tannic swamp rivers of the Gulf coastal plain. But the species is documented in both systems with historical and contemporary records. The deep channel pools of Ozark Rivers, where the current slows and the water accumulates above bedrock shelves 10 and 15 feet below the surface, provide exactly the kind of cold, structured substrate that large, sedentary, cold-blooded ambush predators require. The geographic isolation of Ozark River populations from the larger downstream Mississippi populations is also significant. The river corridors narrow and steepen as they enter the plateau from the south, and the gradient increases in ways that create natural movement barriers for large bottom-dwelling turtles. A male alligator snapping turtle in the upper reaches of the current river is not a recent migrant from the Mississippi floodplain. Whatever animals are in the Ozark River pools have been there, or are the direct descendants of animals that were there, across the harvest decades and into the protection era. And what has been there, apparently, is older and heavier than the survey models predicted. Before speculating about mechanisms, the biology of the animal needs to be stated clearly, because any explanation of the pattern has to stand on that foundation. Alligator snapping turtles grow continuously throughout their lives. This characteristic, called indeterminate growth, is shared with fish, some lizards, and a handful of other long-lived vertebrate groups. Unlike mammals, which reach an adult body size and cease adding significant mass, a male Macrocoles teminki in its 40th year is larger than it was in its 30th year, and will be larger still in its 50th if it survives. The growth rate slows as the animal ages, but published data finds no point at which it reaches zero. A comprehensive review of alligator snapping turtle growth data, published in 2012, drawing on mark recapture records from river systems in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas, found that adult males continued adding measurable shell length and body mass through the oldest age estimates in the dataset, which reached into the 60-year range based on growth curve modeling. Longevity in wild populations remains poorly characterized. The species was not the subject of systematic long-term individual marking studies until relatively recently, and no cohort of marked animals has been tracked through a full lifespan in the wild. Captive individuals have reached confirmed ages above 70 years. Growth models suggest some wild individuals may survive considerably longer, though that figure is not formally verified by direct tracking. Diet in Ozark River systems adds another variable. Alligator snapping turtles consume fish, freshwater mussels, smaller turtles, carrion, crayfish, and seasonal plant material. Ozark rivers carry recovering populations of smallmouth bass, sucker species, carp introduced across the 20th century, and various catfish that have benefited from reduced commercial fishing pressure in the upland corridors. A large low-metabolism ambush predator in a river whose prey base was also recovering from human pressure would have access to food concentrations that may be higher now than at any point in the last century. The thermal factor matters too. A turtle in a 58-degree spring-fed river pool burns substantially less resting metabolic energy than one in a warm lowland swamp. The surplus converts to growth more efficiently. Put those three factors together: continuous growth in an animal that may live decades past the protection cutoff, a recovering prey base, and the metabolic efficiency of cold spring-fed rivers, and a biological argument for the pattern begins to take shape. It is not complete. It does not account for all of the recorded sizes or the apparent geographic concentration, but it is a place to start. If you have made it this far into this particular question, subscribe. This channel covers the cases that wildlife science has not finished closing. And if you have ever seen something in an Ozark River, something large and motionless below a limestone ledge or pressed flat against a gravel bar in 4 feet of clear water, and you did not know what to make of it, leave it in the comments. It may be more relevant than you think. This has happened before. Not with this species, and not in these specific rivers, but the broader pattern of a long-lived protected animal recovering in ways that outpace the initial models is documented across multiple species and multiple conservation timelines. The lake sturgeon provides the closest structural parallel. Accipenser fulvescens, native to the Great Lakes and their tributary rivers, was commercially harvested through the 19th and early 20th centuries at rates that drove it to functional absence in most of its historical range. State and federal protections took hold in the 1970s and 80s. In 2019, a survey team working the Detroit River as part of a long-term population assessment measured a female lake sturgeon at 6 feet, 4 inches, and estimated her age at approximately 95 years based on growth ring analysis from a fin ray sample. That animal had been present in the river during the decades when the species was considered essentially gone from the system. She was not a recent arrival from a recovering population elsewhere. She was a survivor who had continued to grow, invisible to surveys that were not designed to find her. The documented term for this in conservation biology is cryptic persistence. It describes the phenomenon where individual animals, or small remnant populations, survive in areas where the species is considered extirpated or functionally absent, growing older and larger and largely inaccessible to standard monitoring methods. The alligator snapping turtle is a strong candidate for cryptic persistence by temperament alone. It lives on the bottom of deep river pools in water that is often turbid enough after spring floods to reduce visibility to zero. It does not move frequently. It is dark-colored and textured in a way that makes it nearly indistinguishable from limestone rock and submerged root debris in low-light conditions. A turtle pressing itself flat against a chert shelf in 12 feet of Ozark River water is functionally invisible to a researcher in a canoe on the surface above it. The American black bear recovery in the Arkansas Ozarks offers a different angle on the same pattern. After substantial range contraction and population reduction through the early 20th century, reintroduction efforts conducted between 1959 and 1967 established a population in the Buffalo River country of northwest Arkansas. That population expanded beyond predicted range boundaries within 2 decades, with animals appearing in drainages where models had not projected them, and at body weights that exceeded expected averages for a recovering upland population. The recovery outperformed its projections because the habitat was more productive than the models assumed, and because the animals that had persisted through the difficult decades were already large, already established, and had decades of further growth ahead of them once harvest pressure was removed. What these cases share is not a mystery in the biological sense. They share a documented principle that when harvest pressure is removed from long-lived animals in food-productive habitats, the individuals that survived the harvest years continue growing, and the population structure shifts toward age classes and size classes that were impossible while removal was ongoing. The projections fail because the projections do not account for the animals that were there the whole time. Honesty requires saying plainly what the skeptics get right. The skeptical case is reasonable and should be heard before it is answered. If unusually large alligator snapping turtles were present in Ozark Rivers in numbers that represent a meaningful departure from the recovery projections, systematic surveys by trained biologists using standardized methods should be producing consistent, replicable data that clearly demonstrates that departure. The surveys are happening. The databases exist. Why does this remain an open question rather than settled science? The answer comes in 3 parts, and not one of them requires the animals to be absent. The first part is coverage. The current river drainage alone covers approximately 350 miles of navigable river channel in Missouri, with dozens of tributary reaches extending further into the upland plateau country. The Spring River system in northeast Arkansas adds another 150 miles of primary channel and associated backwater areas. The FikeNet surveys deployed in these systems, even in the most intensively funded seasons, cover a fraction of the available habitat. Nets, set at specific transect locations on specific overnight dates, capture animals that happen to pass through those specific positions during those specific nights. An adult male alligator snapping turtle, a sedentary animal documented to move less than a mile over the course of an entire active season, can spend years in a deep channel pool positioned between 2 survey stations and never encounter a net. The absence of the animal from the survey record does not indicate its absence from the river. 40 nets deployed across 300 miles of limestone river is not a survey of that river. it is a sample. The second part is classification. When a very large turtle is captured and measured, the number goes into a database, but the interpretation of that number is filtered through prior expectations about what the population should be producing. A survey team that captures a 150-pound animal in a reach where the expected adult male average is 80 pounds may record the measurement accurately without flagging it for cross-institutional review. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission database and the Missouri Department of Conservation database are maintained by separate agencies under separate institutional umbrellas. A pattern that exists across that state boundary may not be visible to researchers working within either state individually. The data points accumulate. The pattern, if it exists at the scale the accumulating records suggest, may require a cross-institutional synthesis that has not yet been formally conducted. The third part is what happens to a dead alligator snapping turtle in an Ozark River. Unlike a large mammal that dies on a hillside and leaves a carcass visible to passing researchers for weeks or months, a dead river turtle sinks. The soft tissue is consumed by scavengers, primarily crayfish and catfish, within days. The shell persists longer, but settles into substrate, and in a river system with active spring flood events that move gravel bars and deposit sediment, a shell can be buried and move significant distances from the death site within a single high water season. A 170-pound animal that dies in a deep pool in April may not exist as recoverable remains by June. The river processes the evidence efficiently. The absence of physical evidence in a limestone river system is not evidence that the physical animal was absent. The skeptics are asking the right questions. The questions do not have simple answers, but the absence of simple answers is not the same as the absence of the animals. So let us return to the aluminum boat on the current river. The turtle weighed 171 pounds. Its eyes, golden brown and steady, tracked the researchers without urgency, without the reactive thrashing that smaller specimens often display when confined to a surface environment. Its shell wore a coat of green algae along the rear keels, algae that accumulates over years of stillness on a river bottom where sunlight filters down through clear, cold water. The lingual lure inside the open mouth, the small pink worm-shaped appendage it trails in the dark water to attract fish to a jaw that does not move to pursue them, flexed slightly in the morning air. Then the jaw closed, and the animal was still. The research team photographed the shell from multiple angles, recorded the GPS coordinates of the capture location, noted the pool depth and the substrate type in their field log, and released the turtle back into the cold water of the current river. It sank in less than 3 seconds and disappeared against the limestone gravel of the river bottom. That animal carries a history that no database fully recovers. It was alive somewhere in this river system, or in a tributary connected to it by a corridor of cold water and limestone substrate, before the legal protections began. It survived the final years of commercial harvest pressure, in a river where large males were commercially valuable and where turtle buyers traveled the Ozark roads during the warm months. It has spent the protection era in deep cold pools, eating fish, adding weight, sitting motionless on the river bottom with its mouth open while the current river ran over and around it through summer low water and spring flood and the long frozen weeks of Ozark winter. Whether there are dozens of animals like this distributed across the Ozark River systems, or hundreds, or whether this individual represents the rare exception that the biology allows but does not guarantee, is a question that the current survey infrastructure and available resources cannot answer definitively. What the accumulated data will not support is a simple dismissal. The pattern exists in the survey records of 2 state wildlife agencies across multiple river systems and multiple survey seasons. The biology provides a mechanism through which the pattern is not merely possible, but, in the right conditions, expected. The history of the Ozark Rivers provides a context in which the conditions appear to have been met. The current river keeps running cold and clear out of its limestone springs, through the Ozark Plateau, south toward the Black River, and eventually the Mississippi. Whatever is living in its deep channel pools, in the water below the gravel bars and the fallen sycamore trunks and the limestone shelves that drop away into the dark, is living there whether the survey nets find it or not. The surveys keep returning. Methodologies are being refined. Acoustic monitoring and environmental DNA sampling are beginning to complement the traditional fyke net approach in some reaches. The data keeps accumulating. And the question stays open. Not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence is pointing somewhere the models did not predict, and because the river has not finished producing what it has apparently been growing for a very long time.